LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host, Greg Moffat. The first part of the show is free. To listen to part 2, visit legalize-freedom.com and scroll down the homepage to choose your membership. Although not essential, it is recommended that you go back first of all and listen to part 1 of this talk, which you'll find a link to on this interview page. What do religion, communism, space travel, extraterrestrials, life extension technology, and nuclear apocalypse have in common? As unlikely as it may seem at first glance, each is a dimension of a long-gestated plan to gradually replace biological human beings with first, technologically enhanced transhumans, then artificially engineered posthumans, before a proposed final stage where what was once humanity exists only as rapidly fading memories in a virtual reality void. Artificial intelligence is key to these plans, and as a possibly soon-to-be extinct species, we are rushing headlong to meet our doom. Manipulated by woke propaganda, the trans agenda, environmental alarmism, and all manner of orchestrated political, economic, and social crises, increasing numbers of ordinary people now believe that humanity's survival is not only of no significance, it must be prevented. A powerful anti-human egregore has been unleashed in collective consciousness, and the next few years will determine whether it can achieve complete control. Hello and welcome, James, and thank you so much for joining us once again on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Great pleasure to talk to you again, Greg.
Now, it wasn't that long ago, just a couple of weeks basically, since we last spoke, and we were talking about had a conversation sparked by your latest book, which is called Trotsky versus Jesus, Battle of the AI Millennium. We're going to continue that discussion today. It's not essential, but because this kind of will stand alone, or this discussion today, but I would encourage listeners, if they haven't listened to the first part, of our conversation, which will be linked incidentally on the interview page for this, to go back and check that out, and indeed all the other interviews you've done together, but in particular, part 1 discussing your latest book. I'm also going to dispense with the usual guest biography today, because if people want to know about you, if they're new to your work, they can read the information about you. You can listen to you talking about yourself on part 1, or they can just go to your website and it's all there. The title of the book, Trotsky versus Jesus, Battle of the AI Millennium, there's a lot in that just in itself, because look, you're talking about anti-religious kind of political philosophy. You're talking about religion, and then you're talking about artificial intelligence, by definition, cutting edge of technology today. And obviously, listeners will already have heard the intro that I recorded for this. We're going to be talking a great deal about space travel and how this, in a very, very unlikely to the untrained eye, how unlikely overlap with this with the world of Trotsky communism and Marxism and all the rest of it. Now, there's an essay that I wrote a few years ago called Out of This World, Out of Their Minds, Transhumanism and the Colonization of Space. That's what really was a summation of my interest in this area at that time. And, listeners can find that to read for free at legalizefreedom.com. I really talked very much about transhumanist and posthumanist ideas, and of, that the human being was, now obsolete, the biological human being obsolete, and how the future would be one of either elites, living on island paradises or living off-world, like in the film Elysium, either because the Mad Max version where we messed up this planet and we need to get off-world and go somewhere else and start again, or the Star Trek version of it, which is we've done so well here, we need to export this evangelically around the galaxy. So, and as you mentioned in your book, the link between the Trotskyism story and philosophy and worldview to, religion, space travel, science fiction, ancient astronauts, ETs, all of that. So what we need to do, just as an introduction, is just as a brief starter for people, how on earth does, communist philosophy and worldview overlap with anything to do with space travel or colonizing other worlds, as a starter point for me, it just seems to be that, both are incredibly utopian.
Yeah, very interesting. There's a book, I think it's called The Red House, which is a study of the Bolsheviks after they took over and if you like, the center of administration in Moscow. And it looks at the personalities there. A lot of them were killed subsequently. But really, people forget about the intellectual ferment that drove the Bolshevik revolution. And that, as Dostoevsky had anticipated, that once you reject God, everything else is allowed, if you like. And they really did consider all the options that were available, informed by science. So people forget that Marxism and Bolshevism was heavily invested in a scientific, futuristic worldview, inspired by people like Nietzsche, etc., but in particular by the advances in science. They forget also that the Bolsheviks really were inspired by a vision of space. They were inspired, the idea of the Red Star, for example, of course refers to Mars and to communism, and brings us right up to Elon Musk, kind of the Marshall element, but also the space element. Science fiction, as we know it, in many senses, a lot of it was associated with Russian thinking, as was dystopia with Zamyatin and we in 1920, because he saw where it was going. And we underestimate and forget how much this vision of material transcendence was in the DNA of communism and dialectical materialism. Now, Trotsky was a futurist, certainly, and he was inspired by ideas of eugenics and technocracy. He wasn't that interested, apparently, in the space dimension, but a lot of people around him were, including people like Bogdanov, who had written about space travel. So they were very, very close and very important in the Bolshevik movement. But that element was not only traceable to the concentration of materialism, but grew up from an unlikely compost in Russian, Orthodox, and Slavic thinking, in particular from people like Nikolai Fedorov, who in the 19th century was very influential through his work as a librarian in places like Moscow and elsewhere. And he used to have kind of seminars, and he influenced people like Dostoevsky and also Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who became the father of rocket travel. And what we see is one very specific element which becomes mixed into Bolshevism about the reason why people should go to space. Now, of course, we know that since time immemorial, people have had an idea that they could fly, they could copy the birds, emulate the birds. We have Daedalus and Icarus. It's always been there. People have always dreamt about flying. And there's a strong connection between air travel to space, and great spiritual innovators. Swedenborg designed an aeroplane. We can see it in Arthur Young, who designed the Bell helicopter. There's this curious connection. And in many ways, I think it mirrors the idea of the shamanic traveling, the inner traveling, where people can sense or can sense they're traveling or are traveling through different dimensions. And that can be projected through out-of-body experiences, etc. So there's a kind of crossover in the esoteric world between the two domains. And we see it also in the time of the scientific revolution, the Reformation. We see it coming back on the agenda in places like Oxford with Reverend John Wilkins, and talking about traveling to the moon. And this idea is a deeply recurrent one. But in Russia in the 19th century, we get this idea that a particular idea, which became Russian cosmism or biocosmism in particular in the 20s, it became really popular as the revolutionary spirit was growing. And the daft origins of this idea was a kind of perversion of Christian ideas informed by other currents, whereby people like Fedorov came to the conclusion that justice required that everyone who had died should be physically resurrected, and that all of the people who had ever died should be physically resurrected. So the idea of resurrection was taken and materialized in a way which is kind of very, very difficult to understand in any rational sense. And it underlines to me the consequences and the cost of abandoning kind of systems like the scholastic tradition in Europe, which provided a coherent view on which society could work from. So Fedorov influenced directly the people who wrote, like Tsiolkovsky, the rocket equation, who was the grandfather of space travel, who influenced Goddard and Werner von Braun. And again, when we think Werner von Braun and the Nazi connection, we begin to see that space travel is connected, actually, in modern times, with a lot of strange people and a lot of people who are not particularly interested in humanity as they find them, but in some future humanity or some element of humanity. And in Fedorov's vision, because of the amount of people that would be brought back to life, that was one of the reasons why we had to become cosmic travelers, as well as having a cosmic consciousness, if you like. So these ideas, although they involve the resuscitation of individuals notionally from dust and things like that, incredibly as it may seem, it becomes a type of collectivist idea that we see in people like Teilhard de Chardin, who really presented a kind of heretical view of Christianity. And they all contribute towards a transhumanist, post-humanist idea. They have influence from the 70s and 80s, the Silicon Valley, and people like Elon Musk, directly and indirectly as they became known more in the West after Glasnost and other ideas. So certainly there was connections with H.G. Wells and other people and Jules Verne, and again we can see in Jules Verne the anticipation of travel to the moon from Florida, even very, very directly. So, but these concepts were there, but there are some weird origin stories of that particular type of space travel, or why it happened in Russia. And these ideas seem to influence people around Putin in a contemporary sense, although it doesn't get much attention. It's kind of a penumbral thing. It's not central, but that type of thinking is there. The ideas of immortality, of physical immortality, of space travel, and associate with that intelligence increase. And they are the basis of the countercultural movement. SMILE, space migration and intelligence increase and life extension, was of course Timothy O'Leary's idea, reflected in and accepted by people like Terence McKenna, and Robert Anton Watson. Again, people may forget that, unfortunately, when his daughter was tragically killed, he had her brain cryonically preserved.
Do you mean Wilson?
These ideas of cryonics, etc., again come from that milieu. Sorry,
do you mean Robert Anton Wilson?
Yeah. Sorry, what did I say? Watson?
Yeah. Just if people want to look it up,
Robert Anton Wilson, yeah. Yes, so what I argue is that when we have given up, say, if you like, the Western Christian, in particular, the Catholic view that the philosophy associated with scholasticism, and it was the center of European thought for hundreds of years, there's a cost to it, and we think that there's a kind of neutral zone of thinking which will be reasonable and rational. But it doesn't end up like that. And we see underneath these as well a great fear of perishability. And this was important in Teilhard de Chardin's worldview, that they resist this idea that we will decay, and they're unable to accept this idea of death. And obviously, if you believe that people have to be physically resurrected in that sense, you're kind of denying that there's anything after death, which, again, most of the spiritual traditions don't. Now, Russian cosmism did have a purely spiritual element associated with a number like Berdyaev, etc., who became more traditional and applied their ideas in a more synthetic or syncretic way with existing and traditional thought as well. So it's not all the materialist sense, but it's a milieu in which a lot of the Bolsheviks were involved in.
Yeah, just a few minutes ago when you were talking about, even just air travel and that whole, thing about being able to fly, going back to Icarus, and how early on, flying machines were kind of being, created in people's minds long before we were really able to create them in reality. And yet flying machines go back in ancient mythology, don't they? This is where ideas of ancient aliens come from, the chariots of fire and all that sort of thing. Talking about that, I mean, the first thing that sprung to my mind was in the article that I wrote that I mentioned earlier. I talked about, what a blow it was, for the Challenger disaster, for example, and the cancellation of the space shuttle program. And these things were just basically glorified airplanes that were flying in the upper atmosphere. They were never designed to go into space, but that's how it was sold. And then even that last Concorde crash that we had, I can't remember exactly when that was, Concorde being the supersonic jet that was, rolled out commercially for a while. All this, never mind the crash and the tragedy that was, but just the cancellation of Concorde is a thing. For so many people, it had emotional attachments to it, and it really felt like a backward step. And the same with the Voyager missions. Why didn't we go back to the moon, and all the attendant excitement about the possibility of doing it now, with the Artemis thing and whatnot. So it really catches people's imagination, I think, at all sorts of levels, subliminally as well.
Yeah, and when Reagan is saying about how we have slipped the surly bonds of earth and touched the face of God, it seems to work. It seemed to work for people. There was something transcendent about that, escaping from the earth. So what is interesting is that this space travel thing has become pronounced in the last decade in very unique ways. Of course, we see it in Elon Musk, and there is a shift in between the 1880s, if you like, although it became important in the early 20th century in the Russian context. In Britain in the 1920s, it became pronounced, the space travel idea. And we see that in J.D. Bernal, the Irish-born crystallographer, who was a communist, like a lot of his crystallographer friends, the father of the science of sciences. And he was the one that identified what became the SMILE idea for Timothy O'Leary. It's there in the 20s. And he was around with Haldane and all the other. And it was about the time, as I've explained, that the British Empire was changing its shape into a kind of technocratic, financial, distributed, corporate, transnational form, if you like. I believe that it didn't go away. The elite didn't go away. And he explained that really this was, the space travel was necessary to escape, for the elite to escape the Earth. So that was clear, and that the people on the Earth would return to Silicon, hence later Silicon Valley. They would be transformed into a post-human state, into material. And the elite would have to have a place to go off Earth. And the people that wouldn't, the humans that wouldn't be transformed, would live in the human zoo. So it's all there. So I can't see, and people keep, anytime I mention Terence McKenna or Timothy O'Leary and you say anything critical, people come back to me and say, oh, that's not fair. They don't give me argument. This is what the guys were doing. They were front men, effectively, for the elitist, both communist and capitalist, the neo-imperial people that we have running the world through tech corporations. And Bernal, in his book, The World of Flesh and the Devil, explained that scientific corporations would take over the world by stealth. And that has happened. So a lot of our world is being defined by scientific corporations, no more so than companies like Palantir. And if you listen to Alex Karp, and he's actually a kind of personification of the sorcerer figure that Norbert Wiener anticipated when he was critiquing the cybernetics that he had been involved in himself. So Wiener, and as the kind of father of cybernetics, understood stochastics and probability, and he understood, if you like, as I would say it, that the stochastics would replace the scholastics, the idea of an individual that we had in Europe for hundreds of years. Now that idea was posited really on the traditional theology that every individual has a soul, and that soul involves intellectus and ratio, the intellectual and the ratio ability that can be developed through spirit to align itself with God in one unit, in personhood that reflects the divine image. And as we abolish those ideas and say, well, we're just consciousness, and does consciousness exist, and why does it exist, and we abolish all those things, we make ourselves slaves to the post-human vision of these, people in the scientific community, the tech bros, who are really, in philosophical terms, nut jobs, that don't have anything which is going to support you. They will claim that they're protecting you, but really they have a very strong misanthropic view of humans. They don't like humans. It's quite clear. They don't like the species. They think other species, you can't be speciest. And this, why are we succumbing to the power of these people? And it's even worse, more directly. And Palantir, of course, is a reference to Tolkien and crystals that you can see different places, which we also find in I think, The Secret Egg, or The Crystal Egg, that H.G. Wells talked about, this fascination with crystals, which underlines the DNA study going back to esoteric examination, sorcery, etc. They knew that crystals were critical. We hear Karp saying that, for example, he seems to be very much against the far right, or identifying the far right, and having perhaps played a role in this notional rise of the far right in Europe, at the same time where he's expressing himself now as an American nationalist that will use force to kill anyone who opposes American interests. So it's kind of like what Philip K. Dick anticipated as a type of left fascism being in power. So these technocrats can use both left and right, and Peter Thiel has said that about they wouldn't be elected democratically, but they can achieve power in the way that Bernal anticipated. And what's curious, more recently, whereas we do have a strain of the frontierism, the idea that space is a new frontier, the final frontier, Star Trek, that fits into the American psyche. We can understand that, and that makes sense. But in the last couple of years, we have people like Alex Jones, who seems to have, come out of his own closet in a way. And so he's coming around saying space travel is the solution to all this. Now, you could put that in the frontier mentality. It's supported by people like Eric Weinstein, saying that the big solution to this is space travel. But all of that language is totally consistent with this 100-year-old tradition of creating a colony for the elite to escape the mess that they make on Earth. A huge cost. It's nothing got to do with humanity. They're not interested in humanity. They're not interested in the nation state. They're not interested in patriotism. They're not interested in people. So a lot of this is nonsense. They don't even look serious. When they're saying these things. It is a curious recent aspect of the change in politics. It's because really another reason is because the things that they claimed they wanted to do in office have been revealed to be a great tissue of lies. So this is a handy recurrence that serves the interest of the people who believe in immortality. So Jared Kushner is talking about, well, we may be the generation that reaches this physical immortality. And it's utter nonsense. It's utter nonsense that we all suffer from because we have taken some of these ideas so seriously, and we have forgotten who we are. So in this, there is the issue of who are we and what are we ontologically. And once we've abandoned an idea, a deep theological idea, we must pay there are a huge cost to that. So that's why I'm a bit more vociferous recently, haven't criticized on other basis all these things, to explain that there's an important philosophical base there. Even if one doesn't accept God or accept whatever religious principles, these were invisible lineaments in the culture of Europe, which are being utterly destroyed deliberately to have a heterogeneity that can't resist this final collectivization, a totalization, as people like the ecologist Bernard Charbonneau realized that Chardin's idea was that, to create a collectivist total material force, and the fairly grim visions.
Well, whether we're talking about communist utopia or a transhumanist utopia, both proponents of either or both of these, or critics, should, if they haven't already, should now be able to understand the profound similarities. Basically, it's the same mindset fundamentally, just transported across a few decades and many technological developments. And one of the reasons that I'm skeptical of the transhumanist and the whole getting off world and colonizing the space agenda, as I would have been in the past about communist utopian ideas, but particularly regarding the former, is they're both kind of Promethean in the sense that what we've talked about previously. We got that that whole Icarus idea of flying was Promethean. It was just we become like the gods, or however. But everything from beyond even technological limitations, in my mind, everything from Lovecraft's "we're not meant to travel far" type ideas, you know what I mean, and that out there is a black void of nothingness, and we should content ourselves with this, micro dot that we're occupying at the minute, through to people who have, whether they landed on the moon or not, they have left the Earth's atmosphere and gone out into space, have come back profoundly changed. And some people have spoken about a sense of, whether even in a subtext of people's accounts of the experience, this is not for you, this is not for us, if you see what I mean. So I think it's entirely possible that we are simply either cannot or are not meant to leave this planet. And that doesn't have to be a negative. It could just be a reality of this dimension. That's just the way things are. That only becomes intensely problematic and traumatic if you think that this is all there is. If you see what I mean, that this life and this material existence is all there is, then the idea that we're confined like this must be incredibly difficult. It's like being disabled, and physically disabled from childhood or something. You see the things that other beings can do, and you're told that you can't do any of that, because our imaginations can run wild, and the idea that our physical reality can't keep up with that, it must be profoundly disturbing for a certain mindset.
Yes, there is certainly a desperation associated with that. There may be hidden reasons as well. For example, if we look at Dr. Faustus or Dr. Faust, or particularly Marlowe's version, so Faust knows that when his time has come, that the devil Mephistopheles is coming to bring him back to Satan, and he knows that, and Marlowe doesn't mince words in that. He doesn't kind of do what Goethe does and make it, change the ending. So he knows that he got the powers of sorcery with the help of the devil, if you like. Well, I was in this case because that's what they believed, and he was around the same time as John Dee, of course, and Shakespeare and The Tempest. So he knows there's a price to pay. So if you know that you've done a deal with the dark side and that you've got powers in that sense, it's another reason why you want to have life extension, because you don't want to pay the consequences. And a lot of these people that pretend that they're not interested in the spiritual world are interested in the spiritual world. And associated with that, I have wondered recently or speculated about this idea. I'm particularly talking to Charles Upton, and other people that are going back to Jacques Vallée, that when we're talking about these greys, etc., that are not extraterrestrials. They are alien on this planet. They are beings or entities that live on this planet. And then you have the idea that there is a covenant between these underworld figures and science and particular people or magic, that the spirits or discarnate bodies or plasmoid figures or fairies, as they cross over, or jinn in the Islamic context, as we see in the story of Aladdin and the lamp, they can give you power. They can, and this is the basis, of course. This is why people like Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, was engaged in magic beforehand, treasure hunting, and that's what spirits were used for in many senses, to gain power. That was the basis of conjuring. Now, if these spirits are not extraterrestrial, in fact, that they're creatures who are bound to this earth and they're more of the underworld, and literally of the underworld, well, then one might consider whether people who are bound to those beings, who had done a deal with them, may be able to escape their power if they go off the world, off the earth. And that's worth considering, that there is a kind of reverse psychology or another reason why people are interested in transhumanism and escape, especially engaged in Faustian pacts with strange beings on this planet, which a lot of people have claimed to do, which is the basis of a lot of magic. It's there in John Dee when he's talking about angels and that. We don't know who he's communicating with. We don't know when the sorcerers are communicating with beings and do get information and do get power. We can see this even in Macbeth, when Shakespeare is considering the way there are these spirits and they can fool us, but they are real and they're ontologically recognized and existent. That some of those occult reasons may also play into this strange occultic background, as we see, of course. We see Jack Parsons and his interest in rockets, and we get there an explicit connection between magic and space, and the idea of space as magic, and also being associated with something darker, something possibly satanic, even, we want to put it like that, or Luciferian, whatever way you want to call it. Some other elements fits into, or Promethean in simple terms, we see this strange connection. And also, there's another connection which is odd and hasn't been sufficiently put into the mix. If we look at Daedalus and Icarus, we also see that Daedalus is a critical figure, an inspirer of the Haldane, of the Huxleys. He is the figure that describes or anticipates transhumanism. At the same time, in the 19th century, in London, at the time that Fedorov was writing in Russia, he became famous later, but he was operating around that time with some of his ideas. In London, of course, we had people like William Stead, the journalist, who investigated the disappearance of thousands of children in London. So he went out and he could buy a girl in London, and that led to a court case. He was exposing the massive disappearance of children in London on a huge scale. And he entitles his article, his famous article, about, he relates it to the labyrinth of Daedalus and the idea of the sacrifice to the Minotaur associated with the labyrinth. So there is this idea, a darker idea, right, that's directly linked to some of these mythic figures who inspire the technological figures. And in parallel, remember that Dostoevsky comes to London and he goes to the Crystal Palace and he sees immediately or perceives, as he explains in Notes on the Underground, or as we can infer, that this for him was associated with Baal. He believed there was a dark spiritual context behind all this modernism and futurism. So it is strange that they deny this spiritual element. What's interesting recently, and I can see comments by people saying, but you're wrong, now we have spiritual Marxists, and I anticipate it, I refer to it in the book, that we're going to have a lot of former Marxists, or sorry, not former Marxists, former classical Marxists, who say, well, that's all gone now. We're neo-Marxists and we're spiritual, because they know that the non-spiritual approach is a non-runner for many young people, that it's not going to work. They know there's a spiritual world. They read about near-death experiences. They're exposed to a whole range of spiritual views. Hence, we get this new idea of revolutionaries who are essentially materialist, and they're now claiming to be spiritual. And that spirituality will have to resort to weird ideas such as cosmism and that, because they don't have any other traditions, unless you want to take a bit of Buddhism or Taoism and westernize it and fit it in. Again, that's what happened in this sci-fi Silicon Valley culture as well. Orientalism suits space travel, etc., because it doesn't have the same idea of incarnation and personhood that exists in Christianity. So we do get a very strange mix. But now we have the paradox that Marxists are claiming to be, or some Marxists are claiming to be spiritualists. And I anticipated that Trotskyism, for example, could be made more popular by people claiming, that they're liberating, and psychedelics fits well into that, although there's no real spiritual ontology beyond that. It's an idea of liberation, which fits into a revolutionary framework before the revolution happens, and then we get the bureaucracy that comes in. But there's no doubt, again, psychedelics are prosthesis, the same as prosthesis to the human body, if you read Terence McKenna. And those ideas, I think, are coming back on the agenda. So it will make classic Marxism more palatable, especially when it's linked to a kind of luxury communism, as they're talking about. And if one studies the Marxist Internet Archive or the Trotskyist Internet Archive or any of the big archives of Marx's work, it's ridden with a futuristic sense of technology, in which, ironically, we're not going to have workers. So this idea, this fundamental ontological starting point of the worker becomes a nonsense, as people like Bernie Sanders is now at a late stage realizing. Once you have artificial intelligence in a post-human society, it's not even about workers. It's not even about humans. So that's the problem when you don't have a sound philosophical base to the movements. You can end up with a lot of these movements that that are absurd philosophically, but do have sharp consequences.
Yeah, well, you mentioned Jack Parsons there in passing, and at this stage, I just want to throw out a couple of other shows that I've done that overlap with what we're discussing. So the one about Jack Parsons I did with Thomas Sheridan, that's entitled Sex and Rockets. So you can find that at legalizefreedom.com. And then there's not too many degrees of separation from there to Werner von Braun, you mentioned earlier, who was part of the Nazi elite who then, after the Second World War, went to America to become part of the American space program. And I did a two-parter again with Thomas Sheridan, Rise of the Nazi Death Cult, because of course there's the occult dimension of the Nazi story, which is overplayed somewhat, but it's there. Senior members of the Nazi
Certainly, yeah.
elite did have interest in the occult, but of course the Nazis had their own ideas about space, a space program, not just the V1 and V2 rockets they developed, but I've seen pictures of like what looks like a disc-shaped UFO, the classic sort of UFO of UFO lore, should I say, that the Nazis had developed,
Yeah.
and we're trying to, again, turn that into some form of flying machine. So those two shows are well worth checking out.
Yes, and then we have the curious connection between Werner von Braun and Disney, and of course the arguments about, is moon education videos, or films, etc. So we have all those curious connections, and as you mentioned, the person behind the Nazi exploration of flying saucers was Victor Schauberger, and he, of course, developed this machine which looked like the flying saucers that appeared in the 1950s in America. And there's a very good reason why they would appear so, was because he went to America. The Nazis forced him to do research. He developed his machines. It wasn't in time for the war effort, and he didn't want to contribute toward the war effort. But after the war, he was invited to America, and it seems the CIA took his ideas, and then all of a sudden we had these the appearances in the sky of machines that looked like his design. So the Nazis were making it as a flying machine, but what we after the Second World War was an effort to change the ethos of the world, and in particular to do away with traditional religion, which is a key element in a lot of these movements. And there's a curious parallel with the Catholic Church modernization process after Vatican II. There was big debates about the Latin Mass and about the nature of the Eucharist or communion, and then all of a sudden we have the appearance of these discs in America, and Jung arguing that this was an archetypal projection because people were fascinated with disc things and they saw them archetypally. And we have Strieber subsequently writing his book about contact with aliens, which is called Communion. I have written about the odd connections going back to Jung and the CIA, not just his analysis of Hitler, but also bearing in mind that Jung had explained what the Latin Mass was about and was very kind of laudatory of its significance. And we see that Switzerland was the basis of the movement against that traditional Mass, which is another one of these curious connections where we see that things that we think are actually very related.
Okay, James, so we're now going to conclude part one, and we'll be starting part two, where we'll be talking about where all of this overlaps with UFOs, UAPs, the ideas of a nuclear apocalypse to destroy life on Earth as it is now, or civilization on Earth, and the extraterrestrials will come in and establish global communism, and also the idea that that basically we must reach out to alien civilizations if we're going to establish this communist utopia. So all of this and more in part two. If listeners are not already subscribers, they can just pop over to legalizefreedom.com, the homepage, scroll down to the bottom and choose your subscription.
legalizefreedom.com